So before I gave up social media for Lent, somebody posted this on Facebook. I wanted to share it with you this morning. This image says, religion is a person sitting in church thinking about kayaking, and spirituality is a person sitting in a kayak thinking about God. So I thought about this, and my immediate reaction was, yeah, I get that. Yeah, I connect with that because I love to go out kayak, hike. I like to be outdoors. And there are times I know that sometimes I worship when I'm outside, when I'm out in God's creation and in God's cathedral, and I can find that to be a great place of worship. And so I can connect with God. And you can certainly sit in church and not connect with God. That's possible. We know that. But as I thought about this more, I'm like, this is setting us up. This is setting us up to only think that I can only connect with God and worship God when I'm by myself in a kayak out in the nature. And I would say to you that that's part of it. Yes, we can. There's truth. That's true. Yet there's also something about the community of faith coming together, worshiping together, because we are all God's creations. We are all fearfully and wonderfully made. We are made in the image of God. And when God's people come together and worship together in unity, that can also connect us to God. And so I get connected to God in nature by myself. I also get connected to God when I'm with God's people and worshiping together in a faith community. There's something powerful about that that connects me to God in ways that being by myself cannot connect me to God, and vice versa. It's not one or the other. It's a both and. We need both what we would call private, personal worship and corporate worship, faith community with others. We need both of those to mature and follow Jesus Christ and to become mature followers of Jesus. And I thought about this and I was thinking, what is it about being outside that maybe sometimes I'm connecting with God that doesn't happen when I'm in church? We're worshiping as we've gathered here this morning. So I was thinking about that, and I was thinking there's something that's happening in me. It has more to do with me than maybe the environment, is what I'm suggesting. Because when I'm out in the kayak or on the trail or whatever, something that's not happening is I'm not worried about time. I'm kind of more relaxed. My mind is more open and free. I'm more at peace, and so I'm actually in a state where I'm more open to the presence of God. Now, Tozer said this, who wrote a book called The Pursuit of God. He said this, God never hurries. Think about that. When I'm out in nature, I'm not in a hurry. But God never hurries. There are no deadlines against which He must work. Only to know this is to quiet our spirits and relax our nerves. I think of that as part of worship, not only being out, but even in worship corporately, that it ought to bring us a sense of peace and wholeness. Sometimes I've heard people say, I need to be in worship this week because I need to be put back together. I've had such a week that I just need to be in worship with God's people to kind of put myself back together. And that's kind of it, to get us back in that place, recentered, refocused on God and who God created us to be. There's something powerful about that. But notice that when we worship, though, when God's never in a hurry, and that's what happens when I'm out in the kayak. I'm not in a hurry. But I know that at times when I come to church to worship, I can feel very hurried. What's next in the bulletin? What time is it? How long is this sermon going to be today? Right? So when I worship with my family, I worked on denominational conference staff for 3 years, and while I was doing that, I preached in a lot of different churches, but when I wasn't preaching, I was able to worship with my family in one church, and we would go to the same church every week, and they had everything up on the screen like we do here, and so here's some things that I did when I went to worship that helped me to be in worship. There's a difference between being in worship and doing worship, I would say. So I'm talking about being in worship. So the first thing I did was I didn't wear a watch when I went to worship because I just wanted to be and experience worship, and I knew myself well enough that if I wore a watch, I'd keep looking at it. So I left my watch at home. I left my cell phone in the car, not because I didn't have my Bible on my cell phone, and I could certainly fact check the sermon in the middle of the sermon on my cell phone and make sure that pastor was right. I could do those things, but those became distractions to my worship, so I left the cell phone in the car. And the other thing I did was when the ushers handed me a bulletin, I didn't take one because I wanted to just experience and be in worship. I didn't want to follow worship. I didn't want to look at the bulletin and go, okay, we did that, we didn't do that. Did we miss anything here this morning? Oh, you noticed. I said to these guys, yeah, that's right. Yeah, Len's going to fess up. So I actually said to them before we came in here, I said, it's okay if you guys mess up because I can work with it in the sermon. And so, I don't know whether it was intentional or unintentional. Len could tell you that, but the point is this: when we know what do we do when we notice that? And here's my argument against bulletins this morning. Not that we're going to do away, and we're not doing away with bulletins. Don't worry. But what I'm saying is that we get distracted from actually connecting with God because we're worried about whether or not we did something in the bulletin. And so when we're worried about that, what we're not doing is we're not worshiping God. We're worried about what Len did or what Len didn't do, or we're thinking about other things, right? And so that's why I let go of the bulletin in my worship, because I wanted to just be in worship. And I would just check the boxes, go through the motions of worship if I followed along in a bulletin. Now, sometimes you need them if we don't have screens, but we don't need them here. And the other thing that I know none of you all would ever do is I would then start to read the announcements in the bulletin during the sermon. No, I know nobody ever does that. But those are things. So I'm talking about distractions and ways that we hurry worship along rather than experience worship. That we need to be in worship, and that's the point of being here today. And so today we've been talking in this Rooted series, and we've been talking about our discipleship pathway, and what does it look like for a mature disciple? What does a mature disciple do when it comes to the area of, what area do you think we're talking about today? Worship, right, 9 o'clock, worship, part of the discipleship pathway. And so here are some of the ways we develop as worshipers and the ways that we grow as worshipers throughout our life. And again, this is a process. It's a lifelong process. In each description, I'm going to go through different stages of faith development. But notice in each description, there's an internal recognition and an outward habit. So there's a being and there's a practice, okay? So the first one is, some of us are at points, and there have been a point in my life when I was not seeking God. And when we're not seeking God, we don't feel any need to have a relationship with God, and we're not interested in attending worship. I remember those days when I didn't want to go to worship, I didn't want to attend worship, I didn't want to have anything to do with God. I was not seeking God. God was not a part. I didn't want God to be a part of my life. And so I can understand that place, and there are a lot of people in our society that are at that place in their lives. But then as we move into what I would call a seeking mode, we start to recognize that something happens when people gather for worship. In fact, I remember a young man who would come to worship. I remember the first 2-3 times he came to worship, he would sit right down front here, not in this church, it was another church. He'd sit down front, and I would watch him cry the whole worship service. Now, he had never gone to a church before. He had never been a part of a faith community. And I asked him one time, because I'm like, do you need counseling? Do you need help? What's going on in your life? And he goes, I don't know why I'm crying, but every time I come here, something happens here. He couldn't even describe it. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he was seeking God in his life, and he was recognizing that when he worshiped, and he didn't sing the songs, he didn't go along, he just sat there and wept. But he recognized that God was at work. He recognized that God was doing something, and he knew that God wanted to do something in him as a result of that. And so, stay with me. I'm not moving yet, sorry. Stay on seeking. And he started to recognize, I think it's beneficial to develop a relationship with. That's where he was. He was saying, yeah, I need to have this relationship with God. So he experienced worship in a faith community in a way that he recognized his need for God. And he said, and he attended worship when I am invited or when it's convenient. He actually started to attend worship as a seeker because somebody invited him. You see how that works? Most people say they would come to worship if they were invited. And I know so many people outside the church are just waiting to be invited, waiting to be welcomed in to worship. And then as we move and grow in our relationship with God, then we start responding. Thank you. Responding. We recognize that something happens in me when I worship. God starts to change me, affect me. I want to know more about God, to express my gratitude for what God has done in my life. And I seek to attend service of worship on a more regular basis. So I want to just pause right here and talk about regular. Because I'm hearing rumors. I'm hearing rumors that regular worship is maybe not what I think it is, what the pastor thinks it is, and it's okay. So how many people, I've been polling every service, so don't, how many people think regular means every week in worship? How many people think that? Okay, so that's a majority of you. Anybody want to go out on a limb and think that regular is maybe once or twice a month? How many people would say it's once or twice a month? Okay, so I'm seeing some true confessions there. Because that's what I'm hearing, that people are saying, I can't be there every week, so regular worship starts to look like once or twice a month is regular worship these days. And so I think about that. But I want you to know, we're going to unpack this a little bit, because mature disciples, it's not even about weekly worship, as you're about to see here. Okay, so as I follow Jesus, as I become a disciple, I recognize the purpose of daily worship. See that word daily? Not weekly, not regular, not 4 times a month, daily worship. I love God and I want to have a fulfilling personal relationship with God. I attend worship on a weekly basis. So there's both the private worship, the personal worship, and the corporate worship. Both are components of me as a mature disciple. Both are components. So it's not just 4 times a month, it's actually 7 days a week as I mature and as I grow in my spiritual development. And then lastly, as I'm committing, I recognize, here's the big step, I recognize that my whole life is an act of worship. That means when I work at my job, I'm worshiping God. When I go to the grocery store, it's an act of worship. When I spend my leisure time, it's an act of worship. Every day, 24/7, can be an act of worship when I recognize that my whole life is an act of worship, and how I spend my time and what I do with it is ascribing worth to God. Remember, worship is from the word worthship. Worship is worthship. So whatever is most important to me, whatever I place worth on, I am going to give my time and attention and resources to, if it's worth something to me. That's where I'm going to invest. And so here it is, I seek to love God with all my heart, all soul, and mind. I take every opportunity to worship in the Christian community and privately. It's not an either or, it's both together. It's a habit and it's a way of being. So I have heard from some Christians, some can profess to be spiritually mature Christians, that you can be a Christian, and there's some truth to this, so I'm not arguing the truth of it, but you can be a Christian and not be a part of a worshiping community, a faith community. Now I hear that, and that's very what I would call in vogue today, to be able to do what I've said before is do-it-yourself spirituality. We're into this society of do-it-yourself everything, and we start to apply it to our spirituality. Yet the research, the Gallup organization did some research on spiritual commitment, engagement, and they found that the most spiritually mature and engaged people were people who are part of faith communities, regularly participating in faith communities. And that those people, that was a sign and an indicator of spiritual maturity and commitment, and an indicator of engagement, of spiritual engagement. So the most spiritually mature people in our society are those who are in faith communities versus those who are trying to do it on their own, because there's something important about the faith community that helps us become disciples and be disciples and worship together. There's something important about being in community with other people. Now, I do know that I think if I go and talk to some of those people who are kind of DIYing their spirituality, I've talked to people, and I think there are 2 things that are leading people out of faith communities or away from faith communities, or what we call de-churching people. I like that word, de-churched. So what happens is, one, I think sometimes is an issue of pride. Like, my pride's been hurt, or somebody doesn't agree with me, or somebody doesn't share my same viewpoint or opinion, so I leave the faith community. I leave because my pride's been hurt, or my relationships have been damaged, or something's happened, and so people leave the faith community and they become de-churched, and then they're trying to do spirituality on their own because they've been hurt, or their pride's been hurt, or something's going on. And that's one of the things I recognize. Now, interestingly, Jesus taught about this. And Jesus said, if you have an issue, if you have a problem with a brother or sister, go reconcile with them before you go to worship. Jesus actually said, before you go worship, go reconcile with that brother or sister, make peace with them, and then go to worship so that you can worship God. Because what Jesus was arguing was, look, you can't go into church, worship God, say, God, you're so great and awesome, and then go to someone who's been created in the image of God and and put them down. Or put them in their place because they're in the image of God. And so it's like, I've used this example before, it's like going into the king's throne room, bowing before the king, and then on your way out, knocking over the statue of the king on your way out of the courtyard. So we can't knock each other over and then go worship God. And the whole point of what Jesus was teaching was he was teaching this. He was saying, not avoid worship because you can't reconcile. Go reconcile so that you can worship God in faith, in the community. I think the other reason that people sometimes leave faith communities and become de-churched and don't worship in faith communities anymore is also because of judgment. As I talk to people who are seeking God, as I talk to people outside the church, one of the biggest fears is that they'll be judged when they get here. One of their biggest fears, and that may even be a fear of yours, being here this morning. How are people going to perceive me? How are people going to look at me? Am I going to fit in? Do I look okay? Because part of the question that we ask throughout every other area of life is, am I good enough? We hear people say, if I'm not good enough, if I go in there, lightning's going to strike, the roof is going to cave in. We hear things like that. That's part of that fear of being judged. They're going to judge me when I get there. And so part of the question we ask is, am I good enough? Am I good enough to go into worship in the community? We do that in other areas of our life, don't we? I know right now, one of the good questions that every senior in high school is asking is, am I good enough to get into college? Are my grades good enough? Are my SAT scores good enough? Is everything good enough for me to get in the college I want to go to? When it comes to our jobs, or if we're looking for a job or a job promotion, we're thinking, am I good enough to get the job? Am I good enough to get the promotion? Do I have enough skills and experience? Am I good enough? Or am I good enough to marry this person or be in a relationship with this person? Or am I good enough to make the team? Do I have the skills and abilities to make this team or that team? Am I good enough? That same question sometimes applies when we think about worship. Am I good enough? Am I good enough to worship God? What did the psalmist say today in Psalm 5? He kind of talked a lot about the evil and the wicked and the bloodthirsty and then the righteous. But did you notice how he described why he could worship? It wasn't because he was good enough. Let's go back and look at verse 7. Notice this. The psalmist says, but I, through the abundance of your steadfast love, will enter your house. What is the basis of worship there? It's God's love. It's not anything that the worshiper could do. It's not that he was good enough. This psalm is not about him being good enough. It's about him saying, it's only by your love, God, that I can enter your house. Now keep in mind that this was during a time and a season where people had to offer sacrifices to enter the temple. They had to make themselves good enough to get into worship. They had to offer some sacrifice so they would be good enough, and only one time a year could one person enter into what's called the Holy of Holies, the presence of God, and offer enough sacrifices to be good enough to be in that space and to be present with God. But we as Christians claim that Jesus Christ has been the sacrifice once and for all. that because of Jesus Christ's sacrifice and death on the cross, which we celebrate this Lenten season, that is the reason that we know of God's abundance, steadfast love for us. Hebrew word here is hesed, the hesed of God, the unconditional, unwavering, God's going to love us no matter what. Like, this love never runs out on us. You cannot out-sin God's love. That's what hesed is. That no matter what, you and I can come and worship God not because of what we've done or our merit, but because of God's grace and love for us. And that's really it, that disciples know that. They root themselves in this steadfast love and in this grace of God so that they can grow as worshipers. And the basis of that growth is God's love for them no matter what. The other thing, notice that what's going on here is that there's also the second line there, I will bow down toward your holy temple in awe of you. I think part of what's happened is we have not always been in awe of God. We kind of shrink God down a lot of times. We kind of make God small so that we can bring God along with us. So in a sense, we shrink God down to a size that we can relate to God so that God can walk with us through life. And really, sometimes it's about us leading God rather than God leading us. We just want God to go with us, but we don't want God to actually lead us and be the leader of our lives. We just think, God, I just need you to be with me. And so we shrink a God down to a size that God can go with us, rather than realizing the awesomeness of God. So I thought about this. How awesome is God? How big is God? So here's your science lesson this morning. Science teacher, my dad's a science teacher, I get it honestly. So the Hubble telescope, they took the Hubble telescope and they pointed it into what they call deep space. That means they picked a place in the night sky. So if you go out tonight and get under the night sky, and it'll just be this expanse. Notice that the space goes all the way around the world, not just on our part of the hemisphere. But they took the Hubble telescope, and they pointed at deep space, this dark space where there weren't any stars conceivable by the human eye. They picked a space, and they pointed the Hubble telescope at it, and it was equivalent to you or I taking take a straw with you tonight, go find a dark spot in the sky where there aren't any stars, and then point the straw at it. That's what the Hubble telescope was doing, and stare at that space for 10 days. That's what they did. They pointed it, little straw at the end, and they picked up ultraviolet light. This is called the ultra deep field for the Hubble telescope. And they picked up on light. You want to know what they found at the end of that straw? Here's what they found. Here's what they saw at the end of the straw. 10,000 galaxies. Think about that. You could go out tonight, take a straw, look to the end of it, and I want you to imagine at the end of your straw there are 10,000 galaxies. 10,000, not 20. 10,000. Now, there's the space-time stuff I won't get into, won't bore you with, but this is actually a picture of the formation of the universe in the first billion years of the Big Bang, according to Hubble. And so this is the light they picked up. These are galaxies being formed from the Big Bang. And so this is in the first billion years of creation. And so when you think about that, if there are 10,000 at the end of this straw, think about how many around the whole globe. If we took every straw and pointed at every space in the sky around the whole globe, how much would we see? How big is God? Does that blow your mind? Because that's the point about God. That's all. You see, you and I often shrink God down. But how big is God that God could create a universe full of billions of galaxies? That's the God we worship. That's all. And the amazing thing about this is this, that I think really worship is about gratitude. It's being grateful for this God. It's being grateful for God's grace. That this same God who created the universe, who spoke light into existence, this same God who created all those galaxies, this awesome God, is the same God that loves you with an unconditional, unsteadfast love. God is big and personal at the same time. God is huge and beyond our comprehension, and yet right here with us in this place, in this little microscopic corner of the universe. God is big, and God still loves us. That's gratitude. That's worship. That's all. And see, the heart of the worshiper in Psalms was actually when the psalmist said this. He said, as a result of this, he said, let them ever sing for joy. Ever sing for joy. That means perpetually worship God forever and ever and ever. Amen. Right? Yeah, you could sing it now. But that's part of it, this perpetual worship of God. It's ongoing worship of God. We are ever singing for joy. Wouldn't it be great if every morning we could get up and just know that the God of the universe, the God who created the universe, this all big, powerful God, is loving me right now in this moment every day every day I get up, every morning I get up. That psalm was actually a morning prayer that would be prayed every morning. Wouldn't that be awesome to have that frame your day every day? Knowing that the God of the universe is your God, and that that God loves you no matter what. What do you think about that? I'll leave you with this last quote from Tozer, who said, "Go to church once a week and nobody pays attention. Worship God 7 days a week and you become strange." Right? You go to church, everybody can handle that. But if you start worshiping God perpetually every day, people are going to notice you're different. Now, this is a good strange, not the weird strange. This is a strange where it's like people look at you and go, that's strange. I've never seen that before. I want more of that in my life. I want to be like that kind of strange, not the strange like, ooh, I don't want to be like that kind of strange, right? We all know the difference, right? We want to be strange in that we're different than the world around us, the people around us, that they see something different about us, that we serve this awesome God who loves us unconditionally. They need to see that in us. They need to see that in us. And remember, we are strangers in a strange land. That's what makes us strange, because this is not our home. We're on temporary assignment here. And it says in Revelation that one day every knee will bow, every tongue confess, every nation, every race, every ethnicity, every background will come together in heaven and worship God together without a watch for eternity. And it'll be joyful, and it'll be wonderful, and it'll be awesome. Amen.